I'm Kathryn from Research Rockstar. Thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar. This is about a really important topic, but before I jump right in, I do want to mention that in order to ask questions, well, first of all, we encourage questions. You can simply type your questions right down here in the window. So ask questions in the chat. And we'll keep an eye on the questions that come in, but we really want to make sure we keep this as interactive as possible. So welcome, everybody. So the topic here that we wanted to get into today is to talk about, well, this topic of why. So does why still matter in a big data world? And the reason this has become sort of an interesting topic is because there's a quote that we often hear. We all hear variations of this phrase that, sure, big data tells you what consumers do, but you need market research to get at the why. So I think we've all heard variations on this for some time. And I think it's a really interesting statement, but it is one that also concerns me a bit because it's starting to feel like a little bit of a platitude. So I've invited two of my favorite researchers here to join us today. First, I'd like to introduce Nikki Lavoie. Nikki is a director at MindSpark Research International, and she is just absolutely one of my favorite researchers. She has a wealth of experience in qualitative research in particular, and I think when we talk about why, it's really great to have somebody with that qualitative research background here. So, Nikki, thank you for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
And I also have Evan Oster. Evan is the managing director at Cymark, and one of the things that I really love about working with Evan is he's a quantitative researcher who really understands the world of market research, but he also understands the world of data analytics. And so one of the things that's really great that he brings to us is that he can kind of talk about both sides. You know, what is legitimate and credible coming from what big data can do, and what is really about what we may still need very specific other types of methodologies for. So Evan's here to keep us honest and make sure we're not being too market research biased. I'm counting on you, Evan.
Thanks, Kathryn. And as I said in the lead-up, we promised a brutally honest conversation. So I don't want to be the brute in brutally, but I will be honest.
Excellent, excellent. I appreciate that. Beautiful. So let's go ahead and get started. You know, when we talk about this topic, I think the first thing that I want to make sure we talk about is when we do say why, when we talk about why being something that's important, what do we really mean? And I'll get us started with this one. I think when we say, you know, sure, big data tells you what consumers do, but you need market research to tell you the why, I think that the why is going to vary a bit by what type of project we're doing. So if I'm doing market segmentation, the why I might be after might be the needs, you know, why people have specific behaviors and attitudes that may lead me to want to create a market segmentation model. If I'm working on a project that's more about advertising or messaging, the why might be trying to understand why do certain ads or messages resonate more or less with target populations of interest. And so what the why is going to vary depending on what type of project I'm doing, but the idea is that I'm not just understanding behavior, I'm understanding the drivers behind the behavior. What do you folks think? Evan and Nikki, is there something else there that you would tweak on what the definition of why is in this context?
No, I think that's a really great sum up. It's just a way, the word why is sort of a sum up of context, which includes things like motivations and aspirations and things that are inherently driving behavior. So I think you've summed it up really well.
I agree as well. And like sometimes I use the analogy of like in the big data world, like Internet of Things is a very hot topic. And, you know, my contrast is, you know, when you're measuring things, like things that measure how well a jet engine is performing, it's different than when you're looking at people, because people have motivation. They have agency that drives them to do things. So that makes market research quite a bit different than other big data applications.
Excellent. So I think that we understand then that why can mean different things, but it's trying to get at a deeper level. So we appreciate that why can be important, but does why always matter? So let's transition up to this question, because I think this is really the crux of the matter. If we're saying that you still need market research to get at the why, then are we sure that why always matters? And so for this, Nikki, can we start with you on this question?
Sure. Which is a great question for the quality of the group to get started on, I think, because I think this is one of the pillars of qualitative research, is that we are sort of entrusted with bringing forth the contextual background and understanding the deeper things like emotional barriers and drivers and aspirations behind behavior. So it's possibly a good place for me to start, but I maybe have a pseudo-controversial view on does why always matter. I think somewhere in the background of everything, it may always matter. I think that understanding why is always beneficial. But given the way that we are all seeing projects move these days in terms of we need to make decisions faster, we are spreading our budgets across broader verticals and business units, so therefore we may have less to play with. Can we always explore why? And is it absolutely necessary to explore why? Those are the things I'm not necessarily so sold on. So I think that why can always add value when we have the money and the time and the resources to dig into those things, like what is the emotional, motivation of someone who's looking to buy a new car. Of course, if we can understand that, will it help us? I do believe the answer is yes. But is it absolutely necessary to get at that why on every single project? I'm not sure the answer is yes.
Fantastic. All right, Nikki's given us, started us off with a tough question or a tough reply of not always, even though it would be ideal. Evan, anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I totally agree. And what I would add to it is I think one main point that I have for the whole conversation is about actionability. So, is the why actionable? And also, is it about something big enough? Like, is it about the way you're organizing strategically? Is it about the way you're managing your product? Big decisions where big money is at stake, where the implications are longer term than just sort of a quick turn reaction. Is there something fundamental that's driving the category, the brand, the customer that has legs to it that can travel over time? But if it's short term, if it's tactical, there's not time or money that's worth investing in that.
So this is interesting. So I think I've heard a couple of things that I want to just sort of make sure, read it back to you guys and see if anybody has any questions or comments on this. So one of the things that Nikki mentioned is the issue of speed, and that clearly we live in a very fast world, and I know a lot of insights teams on client-side organizations these days that are actually moving to more of an agile management approach. And when you work in your day-to-day life is very much in the agile mindset, speed, it's all about speed, right? It's all about those 2-week sprints. Everything is about speed. And so in some cases, because of the speed issue, we may not have the luxury of getting into the why as much as we might like to. So I thought that was really an interesting point. So we drive towards agile for various benefits that we're seeking to get there, but does that perhaps limit us in terms of the why, or maybe make why a little bit less important in some cases? And I think that kind of gets at Evan's point too about making sure that the why is actionable. So anybody who's been in market research for a long time has always heard that there are certain types of research projects that tell you something that's nice to know, but it's not necessarily new. So sometimes we do a project and to just kind of confirm something we already know or to explore something we already know. And sometimes those projects aren't as exciting as the projects that really measure something new or discover something new. So how do we keep why actionable, I think is really interesting, and that there are some cases where the why is not actionable. Mm-hmm. So it might be interesting, but it's not necessarily going to help me make specific decisions.
Okay, Kathryn, if I could just jump in on Nikki, did you want to say something?
Well, I wanted to just add really quickly that I think that the point that Kathryn made and that you made earlier, Evan, is totally right about whether or not it's actionable. I think one of the things that gets why caught in this sort of tricky place, this quicksand of like, is it important for us to consider in terms of how we scope our research? I think why is a lot about risk mitigation. I think you can understand what people do, and that can be actionable. You can make decisions based on what you know that people do or what they will do in the future. Understanding why, though, kind of adds a layer of context that mitigates risk for the future. So it's sort of like, if I know why moms are buying this product and not that product, I may be able to prevent certain, drops in sales in the future, or predict a trend that might come up that will boost sales across another vertical. So I think that it's true that a lot of things that don't involve why are in fact more actionable, but in the short term, and why is sort of like it's almost like it's the long game, if you will.
Thanks. What I'd add to that, because we're mentioning speed, and I'm all for speed, I'm all for iteration, but I think there's also the risk of speed without a purpose. And I've seen this happen in two contexts. Like I cut my teeth on scanner data in my early years in market research. And one thing scanner data did was it drove companies into short-term promotional vicious cycle and destruction of brands. And now I see a similar thing with online selling, is that all that data drives companies to over promote. Like I've got to meet my sales for the week, discount, discount, discount. And either way, somehow having a lot of data and immediacy drives people to like degrade their brand and their business. If they had a sense of like the bigger picture, that would be, and why is a big part of that, that would be very helpful.
Appreciated. Those are great points. Thank you, folks. I really appreciate this. So let's maybe it would help if we had looked at an example. So, for example, a common type of project that that people do is these days is message testing, right? So people are trying to figure out what kinds of messages are going to resonate with different target populations of interest. So is it enough in a case of message testing to just test the messages and see which ones work, or do we need to find the why behind the message?
I feel like that's tough to answer, because there's probably more than one why that we're looking at. In some cases, is it helpful to find the why behind the message? Probably yes, but there's probably also other whys that are playing a factor in terms of, what delivery message, what channel is this message coming through on? How is the message being displayed? How frequently are the people seeing this message? And those all contribute as well to the why, in terms of why a message resonates or not. And again, I go back to the idea of risk mitigation, which is, we all do lots of message testing, and there's ways that you can just message test quick fire, pick, A/B testing, this one wins, launch it, and then you know that you're going with the most successful one. But if you happen to know certain elements of the why, you can actually save yourself lots of money on producing future messages, which are obviously going to lose out in A/B testing to other messages that don't contain the same elements or what have you. But whether or not we go into the message itself, like the motivations and the aspirations between why a message is resonating, that, again, is one of those things that is very often a nice to have, but not a need to have, I think.
All right. So how about, can we think of an example where we would say why doesn't matter? I stumped my speakers.
I just remember it was kind of maybe somewhat of a trivial thing, but at one point I actually spent quite a few years working at Bacardi, which is a very, the liquor business is very emotionally driven. So, there was a lot of why there, and not so much hard data. But I remember one time, we had a product, we were going to launch it. It was one of these ready-to-drink beverages. And so somebody said, well, how many Bacardi bats should be on the neck of the bottle? And first of all, it's like, do you really want me to waste my time researching this? And I certainly don't need to know why. Whether 3 or 5 bats is better, why doesn't matter.
Right. And, I think that's actually a great, you really triggered something for me, because here's the challenge. If you had done that, and you could have tested one to see which number of bats on the bottleneck had the most, conversions or whatever the desirable behavior is, or you could have asked people, right? You could have maybe done a focus group or something, and you could have asked people, shown them different variations of the bottle, and asked them which one they like best and why. And I think this is part of the challenge with why these days, is that we can ask people why, but it can be really hard for people to accurately self-report why. I think that over the last few years in market research, we've all learned a lot about how consumers are irrational. And if we ask them why they buy something or why they like something, we now know from really great books like Dan Ariely's Predictably Irrational or Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, we know that if we ask people questions, they will come up with a rational answer. And that answer might have nothing to do with reality. So I think it's great that there are cases where we know we want the why, but now that we also have this greater awareness that it's hard for people to tell us why in a way that's accurate, does that, further kind of diminish the importance of why?
I would actually say that it's the reverse. I think why is just as important. We just have to be smarter about how we figure it out. I think it's great that we've finally figured out that you can't just directly ask why about certain things, about many things, actually, because I think that we've all, I don't know, me personally, when all of the behavioral economics texts and everything started coming out, it was super informative and really interesting to read, but it was also this sort of internal aha, because I knew that somewhere all along. It was like the Wizard of Oz, Dorothy waking up in the movie and saying, "I've always known this," actually. And I sort of felt like that when I started, reading about all of these different books with Dan Ariely and Kahneman and things like that. I think it doesn't diminish the importance of why, however. I think it means that we really need to be conscientious about how we're getting at why, and that blatantly asking why in most cases is not the best way to get at that information.
I want to thank one of our attendees, Rebecca. Apparently she and I were reading each other's minds, so over here in the chat window, Rebecca is also acknowledging that why can be challenging because it can be subconscious, and so we might get an answer that's not really accurate. So Rebecca, thank you for contributing to the conversation. And I do encourage everybody to ask questions and add comments. Evan, I feel like I might have just cut you off.
Yeah, no, I was gonna, but mostly agree with Nikki. This is the value of the skill of a qualitative researcher, is to figure it out, because most consumers are not capable. They're either unaware or unable to express the why, but the skilled researcher, that's what you pull out of it. And, I'm sort of seeing as, in an ideal world, you do that kind of work up front to give guidance, and then there's this other kind of discovery of why from this iterative test and learn A/B testing, because you put a few things out there thinking, well, I think this is the why, and you have 3 or 4 executions that kind of explore the boundaries of that why could be. You see what you get and you iterate. But it's better to go start that process with a theory than just kind of blindly throwing stuff out there.
Yeah, I like that you brought that point up, and that's a great segue, because I feel like there are a lot of cases these days where I am seeing people kind of adopt that, more of that, let's do an experiment and find out, and then from that experiment we'll infer the why, or we'll come up with a hypothesis based on those results. So if I'm running multiple versions of an ad, let's say I'm running an ad for frozen pizza, and on some of the ads I'm featuring pictures of families, and in others I'm featuring things that are green and organic looking, then I'm going to run that experiment, and I'm going to perhaps use those results to help develop a hypothesis that, okay, people seem to be more driven by imagery related to families than about imagery related to organic. Therefore, I get my hypothesis. Is that enough of a why?
If I just jump in again, I think, to quote Daniel Kahneman again, confirmation bias. I'm not sure how many marketeurs we have on the call, but I would say, left to their own devices, marketers usually know what they think works, and they look to confirm it in the studies that they do. So I think we as researchers, and perhaps that's why, we don't quite sit in the total position of power. We're kind of the ones saying, no, we have to question that premise. We're good at questioning others' confirmation bias.
That's awesome. Oh, I see we're getting some contributions from some of our participants. So Stephanie's adding, I like the idea of using the iterations to test the whys, but our teams here on the client side are moving so fast they won't take the time to continue to test. So the test and iterate concept works, but there are only so many rounds of iterations you're going to go through before somebody has to pull a trigger, right?
But from my understanding, if you apply that theory wouldn't apply to successful companies such as Google, Amazon, and Facebook. So they seem to move pretty fast, and they seem to have a culture of constant testing. So, I think it's more of a culture of company because those companies move faster than anybody, and they test a lot.
And I would suspect that also has to do with what exactly you're testing. Are you testing a launch of something that's the launch for a specific product, or are you testing to optimize something that's a more of a longer term, process or project that you're developing? So I think that's.
I would also. Oh, sorry. I would also add, I agree with Evan's point about the fact that it's cultural, but I would go a step further in saying that the culture is probably more than just a culture of testing, but a culture that really values the why. Because there can be a culture of testing, but a culture that doesn't really value things like context. And they're literally just doing constant A/B testing and saying, okay, this one is the winner, and now this one is the winner, and now this one is the winner, and now this one is the winner, and so on and so forth. I do think when there is a culture of really valuing the human element of all of the decisions we're making and getting down on that sort of more granular level, is when like what Evan was saying seems to be true. Constant testing, constant trust in the fact that testing is a better option than not testing, and a sort of reliance on that system and a continual reliance on that system, which allows whatever it is, messages that they're putting forth or new products that are being developed to have more success than those who are only doing limited testing.
I totally see your point, although I would just, I'm trying to be, to look at both sides, and I don't, in my understanding in the projects I've seen, not everybody who's doing A/B testing is doing it blind. There are hypotheses that go into developing what the A/B variations are and for looking for patterns. So you see cases now where people might be testing like 100 ad variations at the same time, and it's meant to, reflect specific theories or hypotheses they have about the needs of different people in their target market. So I definitely, I'm sure there's a huge continuum there of organizations that are thinking a lot about what those hypotheses are, and how they're doing the interpretation. And I'm sure there's cases where it's more of a, automatic, whichever's getting the most conversions wins kind of thing. But I'm sure there's some variety.
I think to be fair, it probably depends a bit on what industry you're in. So I think if you're selling directly to the customer, and if your goods are virtual goods, your ability to iterate is much better. But I think when it comes to communications, so much of communications nowadays is online, whether you're selling detergent or you're selling Amazon Echo. So I think in communications, every company has the opportunity to take advantage of this iterative test and learn approach.
Excellent. And I just want to point out we're getting some really great contributions from some of our participants. So I want to thank everybody for contributing on this. This is fantastic. I want to push a little bit more then on what the best source of why is. And I know there's no one size fits all, but we did talk a bit about what are the great benefits of qualitative research is getting at why. But is that coming from doing focus groups, in-depth interviews? I have to tell you, one of the things that I've noticed lately, this is still anecdotal, I can't say it's a trend, but it seems to me that when I'm seeing a lot of interest in qualitative research these days, it looks like a lot of strong interest in ethnography. Like if we're going to do qual, we are going to go do deep qual. And ethnographic research has always been sort of an ideal. Those of us who've had the opportunity to do it know that it can be amazing, but true ethnographic research is extremely slow and time-consuming. Have either of you seen more of an interest in ethnography or other ways of getting at the why from market research?
I haven't, so what I'll say is I haven't seen an uptick in requests for ethnographic studies from our side in terms of the qual RFQs we receive. However, it used to be that we would receive a request for a proposal and it would include a brief and it would say, here's our business objective and therefore we'd like to do focus groups, and therefore we'd like to do IDIs. And we are pushing back a lot and suggesting ethnographies, at least something ethnographic, an ethnographic element, so a multi-touch qualitative approach, if you will, so that we can sort of get that more raw, observational, empirical element to things, and then we can go back and pose questions. And I will say that although we haven't seen an uptick in requests for ethnography, when we push back and ask if people are willing to make room for an ethnographic element to the study, assuming that it's not a rapid fire decision, which it usually isn't anyway if they're coming to a qual agency in the first place, a lot more yeses are being said to our suggestion to include ethnography than ever before. So it used to be, just exactly as you said, people said, oh, we don't have the time, we don't have the money, it takes forever. And I think people are really starting, especially client side, are really starting to see the value. So one of my favorite project examples is the client literally said to us, we need to do focus groups because we need to understand this thing with new parents. And I said, well, why don't we actually go into their homes first and see what their lives are like, and then we can do the focus groups, and then we'll actually be able to ask much more pointed questions about things we have actually observed without directly asking them why. And then our why will be a lot more fleshed out, and we're getting a lot more clients willing to take on those kinds of projects than we previously were.
Excellent. I think that's fascinating that you're seeing that. It seems like it kind of dovetails a bit with my anecdotal things too. So it seems like perhaps that our hypothesis here might be that that why is still important, and in the world of qualitative research, people who value why might be willing to go a little bit deeper on the, on getting there than they may have in the past. Mark here, one of our contributors, has also mentioned that he uses mostly in-depth interviews. They're a global company. It's also they do B2B. Yeah, so some of these things will obviously vary based on your geographic scope, because there's some geographies where ethnography is more or less appropriate, and also obviously B2B research can be really tough with ethnographic methodologies. So let me ask you guys a question. We all know that a lot of market research professionals are either strong on the quant side, they're kind of survey researchers, and that's kind of where their superpower is. And then, of course, there are market researchers who are more on the qualitative side. Their superpowers relate to focus groups and moderation and perhaps ethnography or online qual these days. And, of course, there are people who do both. But if we just start with the premise that there are, some folks are really on the survey research side and some people are on the qual side, is one group going to be more successful over the next few years with this shift? If we are saying that there are cases where why is important, but now there are also cases where why is not important, who's going to benefit the most from this? Is it going to benefit the qual researchers more or the survey researchers more?
Hey, Kathryn, I also want to just add to the premise of your question is that I think there's a third leg, which is working with behavioral data, because I've worked with survey data and I've worked with behavioral data. But by their nature, they're very different. Behavioral data is typically passively collected. It doesn't involve asking questions, but also the structure of the data and the method of analyzing the data and the tools are different. So even though survey researchers probably have the core skills to work with behavioral data, they generally don't. And I think that's something, if you're the quant person, you should be looking at. And then, to answer your initial question, I'd say I'm kind of advocating this, we all need to work together approach. So the qual researcher, if they could help test and learn people structure a learning plan, that would also be very helpful. Like, not be afraid to, get involved with that.
Excellent.
I would totally agree with that. Sorry.
No, that's great. I just want to bring up, so Evan, when you say behavioral data, when I talk to different market research folks, one of the things I've discovered is that the phrase behavioral data means different things to some people. When I hear behavioral data, what I hear is, well, that's actual behavior. So, if I'm a company that sells online, it's the online transactions or data I may have about what people visit on my site. Or if I'm a brand with a loyalty card, it's the behavioral data I'm collecting through that loyalty card program about what they're purchasing or seasonality or time of day and things like that. Is that what you mean by behavioral data?
That's what I mean. I guess technically speaking, you can do a survey and ask people about their behavior. But when I say behavior data, I mean as you described, the sort of passively collected massive amounts of data, which is just getting more massive with people carrying mobile phones in their pockets all the time. And, and that kind of runs into the big data category, but it's abundant, it's cheap, it's available, it's already been collected, and, that's where a lot of investment is going. So that's what I'm talking about when I talk behavioral data.
Excellent. I want to point out something. One of our contributors here, Cheryl, has added something that I think is extremely valuable. And actually, Cheryl, this really coincides with some of my experiences as well. So Cheryl's saying that I would say there's an even greater emphasis on understanding the why now compared to about 3 to 5 years ago. I attribute this to the rapid growth of the customer experience research area, which is going a lot deeper than just tracking NPS, Net Promoter Score, or satisfaction. I think that Cheryl's really onto something here because I see a lot of emphasis on CX in a lot of big companies, client-side organizations that I work with. Like, when we do training and we have students from client-side organizations, I often hear people talk about CX. And what's really interesting to me is that I think Cheryl's point here is so spot on because CX does try to get at the why. When you do a classic sort of CX kind of research scope and you're trying to understand the entire customer journey and understand their thoughts and feelings and experiences across the customer journey, that's really a very comprehensive way of getting to why. The thing that concerns me, though, just selfishly as somebody who's coming from a market research and insights background, in a lot of companies, I'm seeing that CX is not part of market research. I'm seeing that there are a lot of companies where CX is a separate department or function. Some organizations now even have a C-suite title, so you might have a chief marketing officer and a chief customer experience officer, and there are some variations on that, but it's becoming like a separate function. And as a market research person, it kind of breaks my heart a little bit just because like 90% of the language and the methods that I see used are exactly what we do, but it just has this slight little bit of a lens on it, and it becomes a separate function. So I think Cheryl's point here is just awesome, and I personally, I'm just still a little stumped about why it happened outside of market research so much.
Well, just an example that comes to mind, there's a company I know, maybe people know, called Medallia, and they've really moved into the customer experience space, but they've come at it from a Silicon Valley software as a service approach, even though they run a lot of traditional customer sat surveys. So it's also a business model approach that, in addition to doing the surveys, their premise is they scoop up data from all the sources, from social, from wherever they can get it, integrate it together. So it's kind of a platform approach, which takes it out of the comfort zone of traditional market research.
Yeah, I would add as well, just to say that I see exactly the same thing with UX. So we're actually doing a lot of user testing, and it's exactly the same. I mean, UX is treated as an entirely separate entity from research. I will say that I think UX testing for a lot of the clients we work with does have the benefit of having trained researchers working in the UX teams, but not necessarily market researchers like we would think of with traditional in-field experience. So maybe there are people who have done a lot of experience in academia, and they've done a lot of research focusing around, layouts of I don't know, platforms and things that just like literally relate directly to the user experience. But UX and CX, I think, are heavily intertwined, and there's a lot of overlap because if the UX is bad, the CX will be bad, and then the CSAT will be bad, and then us researchers are just sitting here trying to figure out why. And it all comes back to these other, areas which are really overlapping but kept very separate from us. So I think that's another thing that we should be keeping an eye on is, CX and UX are incredibly important, and everyone seems to realize that, but doesn't necessarily seem to see the link and the potential benefit of connecting that with the consumer insights folks.
The comments that we're getting here are just so wonderful. I just want to thank everybody who's contributing to the conversation because it just goes to show you that there is no one-size-fits-all. It seems like there's a lot of fragmentation. Mark, thank you so much for sharing your experience. So Mark's company is just the opposite. CX is part of 7 departments with no centralization. The base NPS is run through market research. but you see surveys and pop up from other groups, other CX endeavors, it sounds like, are being handled by 7 other groups potentially. You know, I think it's just, CX has become such a hot topic. It's interesting to see how this is going to shake out, but it's still fairly, not that CX is new, but I think how organizations are structuring a lot of this, I think, is somewhat new. And I do see some organizational structure issues just at the, you know, coming, you know, if you look at from a high level, like organizational structure sort of point of view, because like every C-suite survey that I've seen over the last few years, and companies like KPMG and Bain and others do these CEO surveys every year about what do CEOs care about, what does the C-suite care about, and the recurring theme for the last couple of years has been, not surprisingly, that they all want their organizations to be customer-centric and data-driven. So they're all saying, I'm not saying they're all doing a great job of this, but that's what they're saying, right? They're saying this is our, you know, corporate mandate. This is what the CEO wants. We want to be customer-centric and data-driven. And I think that there are some organizational sort of mega trends happening to try to make that happen. And in some cases, it has to do with the organizational structure, like making sure that the different teams that are working with different types of behavioral data or self-reported data, maybe have them report into a single organization as opposed to having them reporting into completely different lines of function. So I do see some changes there.
And since we're on that topic, I would just give, you know, add or give a counterexample is I do have a fair amount of experience. Let's say, you know, the premise of NPS, and it's, you know, been well researched, is that it's a very good predictor of future behavior. But I've had experience working just with simple transactional data. You know, all I need to know is a date time stamp, an ID, and the amount spent. And I can take thousands or millions of those records and build models that are much better predictors of future behavior than NPS.
Yeah, I believe you. I think that's fascinating. So I know we're just about out of time. We supposedly have 6 minutes left, so I want to be respectful to our speakers. But when we then take sort of the step back about the importance of why and where why comes from, is there, you know, when we say to ourselves, and you hear this all the time, sure, big data tells you what consumers do, but you need market research to find the why. Are we, you know, is this a, you know, really a self-soothing platitude that ultimately can shoot ourselves in the foot? Are we over-relying on why as why market research is still so important in a world where big data gets a lot of visibility and CX gets a lot of visibility?
Where I see the pitfall in that approach is that I think there's an implicit passive posture to it, which is someday they'll realize they need me and they will come to me for the answer. And I think that in itself is a big problem. So if anything, I'm saying, you know, get out there and mix with all the other people and contribute together to what they're doing.
Excellent. Excellent. Great point.
The only thing I would add to that is I feel like when we actually look at what is going on in quote-unquote consumerism as a whole, globally, more and more power is being put in the hands of the people. So brands are having to change their strategies because they're needing to, you know, cater to the way people are changing their shopping behaviors. And, you know, I feel like there's a much more clear and a much more immediate impact that the consumer themselves can have on brands. As such, I feel like the why is going to continue to gain in importance because we can have all the behavioral data in the world that's telling us what's going on, and that is a game changer and massively important and can contribute to lots of new ways of looking at why. But if we forget that human beings are still human beings and that they have idiosyncrasies and irrationalities and oddities, and if we forget to explore those and forget to give those things credit, we will lose as much touch with our consumers as, you know, certain brands have been known to do and then have not succeeded. So I think we have lots of tools at our disposal to understand why, and it's a matter of making sure we tap into all of them accordingly.
I think that's an awesome point, and I think that blends really nicely into a point Evan made before, which is that the onus is on us as market research and insights professionals to be sort of data source agnostic. If we are, as market researchers, living in a new world, which we know we are, where there are a lot of different methodologies, both quantitative and qualitative. We know there are a lot of different data sources. There's data sources that come from traditional market research methodologies, but of course now we have all this passive data that Evan was talking about before. There's the transactional data, the behavioral data, online behavior data. I think it behooves all of us that we have a certain minimum level of understanding about what all the options are, because marketing professionals, the people who are ultimately paying for market research and insights work, they are increasingly aware that they have many sources of data, many sources of information to get at customer behavior, and in some cases even the why of customer behavior. So I think that a lot of our risk mitigation would come from just making sure we understand what all the different data sources and options are that our clients are considering, so that, as Evan says, we can work together in a collaborative, integrated way where it makes sense, and we're not sort of limiting ourselves either to this potentially increasingly narrow role of the specific types of methods that market research is conventionally associated with.
Mm-hmm. I think that also goes back to your question earlier about who's going to benefit from this. Is it going to be qualitative market researchers or quantitative market researchers? And I think it's going to be the ones who decide to roll up their sleeves and get their hands dirty. I don't actually think which side of the fence you're on particularly matters. It's going to be the people who are going to take the time to invest in learning at least a little bit of the other skills that need to be learned in order to facilitate that level of collaboration.
Excellent. And Mark actually just contributed a point that I think is one that we are concerned about. Mark has found that the data analytics guys can find the trends but can't necessarily explain why. So we know that there are cases now where they don't care about the why, and so I want to make sure that I don't overemphasize with a client that the importance of why, if that's not something that they're willing to pay for right now. But I think we all agree with Mark that definitely why in many cases is something that those of us who are coming from a market research and insights background, we have a lot of different methodologies and approaches for. But we also know that if you do have a lot of behavioral data and you can do those iterations with some good hypotheses, you have an opportunity to derive the why as well from data in some cases. It's not going to apply for all projects, but certainly projects related to ultimately informing, online advertising, a lot can be derived from experiments. I know we're just about out of time, so I just want to invite people, if you have any last questions or comments, we'd love to answer any questions or comments. And I want to thank everybody who's contributed comments here and sharing your experiences. I know that everybody appreciates hearing from as many people as possible. So I'll give people a chance to add their comments. Oh, you're absolutely welcome. And Evan and Nikki, any closing thoughts from either of you?
No, I thought Nikki summed it up well. I mean, it's actually been a very energizing discussion for me, and I can see all the comments streaming in, so I'm like, wow, people are getting engaged. So, I have nothing left to add at this moment.
Excellent. Well, for all of the attendees, we will be sending out an email with a link to the recording. I'll also give you contact information for both Evan and Nikki, so that if anybody would like to connect with them, that you'll be able to do so. I want to thank everybody for participating. And, the reason why, for me, this was an important topic is I just want to make sure that we're not, as a profession, those of us in market research and insights, I just want to make sure that we're not limiting ourselves by saying, sure, big data is important, but you need us to get at the why. It's a concerning point for me. As Evan says, it's very passive, but also it's not necessarily true. And so I just want to make sure we're being honest with ourselves. And by the way, part of the reason why it's not true is because even that statement, big data tells you what people do, that part of the statement's not entirely true either, right? I mean, it certainly tells us what people do in certain situations, but there's a lot of behavior out there that's not captured online. For example, I was talking to somebody the other day who does a ton of B2B research. Well, when you're in the B2B world, you may not have the same kind of behavioral data at the same level of scale that somebody who's doing consumer research has. So I think all parts of this saying can somewhat be challenged, although I think we all know that, right? Whenever we make generalizations, right, there's some challenges. So hopefully we'll hear this statement a lot less in the future. Thank you so much, folks. I really appreciate everybody attending. I'll hang out in the classroom for a few more minutes, but I'm going to go ahead and turn off our recording for now. Thank you, Evan, and thank you, Nikki. I really appreciate your contributions today.